Let's talk about Lincoln, because what I find fascinating about this is, of course, we feel that we live in these incredibly divisive, dangerous times, which I think is true. I do think that there's a challenge to national unity that is as great as anything we've seen in decades. And so there are moments. So I think it's very valuable to look back at other moments of crisis and division in American history and how we got through it. It often does feel that the decade that seems most parallel to what we're going through right now might be the 1850s. What do you think of that analogy? This is the
I
country bubbling, 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 and the divisions becoming, more and more raw.
I think there's a little something to that analogy. I mean, this is the third book I've written on 19th century America. I wrote a thing about Andrew Jackson and the Cherokees, John Ross, the Cherokee chief. I wrote a thing about an 1850s presidential candidate, John C. Fremont, and his wife, Jessie. And now I've written this Lincoln book where a lot of the action takes place in the 1850s. And maybe one of the reasons I've come to dwell on that part of history is because I feel the parallels as a news reporter covering the news today. It was an increasingly divided time, an ideologically divided time, a culturally divided time, an economically divided time, and a time when people were arguing over questions like equality and who belongs in America and who does not. And you can feel the similarities to today when you read the rhetoric that people use. The issues are different, but somehow the approaches and appeals to other human beings are the same. I want to do one caveat before we go on, and that is people say, well, do you think we're heading for a new civil war?
Yeah.
And at this time, I do not, because I feel that so many of our disputes are almost about nothing. They're pointless. They're performative, to use your excellently chosen word. And it's just hard to see people going to civil war over who's House Speaker or, over the debt ceiling. It's hard to see some of these things being as gigantic and cutting through society as slavery. But political violence, I think, is very possible. Just not a civil war.
So it may not be a civil war between states, but within the states, between red and blue. I mean, so what is the context of January 6th? Because that was a violent uprising.
Yeah.
And we do have this buzz about secession.
Yeah. No, I mean, I think the idea of some political violence is very, very possible because that's really a lot of American history. Even if you set aside the giant civil war where people raised armies and set armies against one another, the more than a decade after the Civil War included tremendous political violence across the southern United States as Black people gained the right to vote and then progressively lost the right to vote and got to serve in office and then progressively were kicked out of office, often through various kinds of violent uprisings and terror campaigns. And we could go all through history. I mean, labor disputes that become violent, the civil rights movement, tremendous violence in the 1950s. We could just go on and on. There's a lot of political violence in this country. I think that more of it is to be expected because of that history and because of January 6th. I'm not saying it's all going to be peaceful and all going to work out. I'm just making that limited claim that it's hard to see. I do not at this time foresee the events that would break the country apart. Check back with me in a year and I'll let you know.
Okay, so we started off talking about Lincoln's political skills because, and I want to talk about in terms of, that he was a politician. And this is something that I think that's what's interesting about your book, that you focus in on that at a time when politics is in very, very bad order. So what were Lincoln's political skills? I mean, you talk about how he wouldn't ostracize people. He didn't have this puritanical approach to politics where he thought that he should separate himself from people that he disagreed with. So talk to me a little bit about that, because, the flip side, of course, is that this is the man that presided over the absolute division of the country in which we killed hundreds of thousands of one another. So how do we reconcile those two things?
Absolutely. I mean, he did not virtue signal. He was not about showing that he was the most proper person with the most progressive views.
Yeah.
He did not demonize people. He was arguing over the greatest moral issue, arguably, that the country has ever faced, slavery. And he considered slavery a moral outrage, but he didn't act like he was morally superior to other people or even tell his supporters to. There's a quote from a speech in 1854. He's in the free state of Illinois. So he's talking to an audience that at least notionally
Right.
opposes slavery, but they probably got relatives and cousins back in Kentucky and other places that practice slavery. And he actually says, if we were in the place of slave owners, we might do exactly as they do. And if they were in our place, they might do exactly as we do. Essentially, he was saying people are shaped by their environment. They're shaped by their circumstances and their interests. And slaveholders had, in many cases, inherited a centuries-old system, which they naturally defended out of self-interest. So he's like, I think there's something really powerful in that that's really useful. I mean, I got a chance to talk just the other day about this book in a church. And I was thinking about that idea of all of us as being flawed, none of us being perfect, all of us having imperfect beliefs on race or anything else that probably will be outdated in 10 years anyway, whatever is we think is proper now. But what Lincoln was willing to focus on, rather than the individuals, was a system that degraded human beings and corrupted human beings and had to change. So that was one thing. I'll mention another thing. Having taken this kind of modest view that he wasn't like morally superior to everybody, he thought about who he was speaking with. He empathized with them and he considered their interests, their self-interest in many cases. He had this view of humanity that everybody is guided in some sense by self-interest, which sounds really grim, but it's also understandable because if we don't look after our interests, then somebody has to. And so he would shape his arguments to appeal to that.
No, that's interesting. I mean, you point out that he spoke carefully, and he did not demonize his opponents, and he shied away from the most radical responses to slavery because he had this, this is their self-interest, this is our self-interest. He had the moral principle, but he was careful not to do that. So, I mean, this is his in practical terms. I could certainly imagine him today, being accused of being too squishy, too soft, too willing to not, because he really was. He was an incrementalist. He wanted to abolish slavery, but he was very pragmatic and in some ways kind of conservative in his approach to it.
People use the word conservative, and I don't think they use the word squish, but people talked about him that way at the time. If you were a radical abolitionist, you might be suspicious of Abraham Lincoln and what he really stood for, and the fact that he would also be like friends with slaveholders, and he also had views that we would consider objectionable, like maybe black people should move to some other country and be free there. So there's a lot there to object to, but he was also a constitutionalist. Mm-hmm. He believed in the Constitution. He believed the Constitution limited what he could get away with in terms of attacking slavery in states that practiced it. So he wanted to do the maximum that was politically and legally possible with a hope that slavery would someday end.
So the stories in the book, I mean, the book is, differ we must. And you use 16 encounters with 16 different people that he disagreed with, that he was willing to sit down with. So let's talk about some of these 16. You talked about Joshua Speed the years before the war. Another one of these face-to-face encounters was Frederick Douglass in August 1863. So what were they differing about? How did that go? Abraham Lincoln and Frederick Douglass in the midst of the Civil War.
Yeah, this is one of my favorite encounters. Douglass. And I guess we should clarify because people get confused. There's Stephen Douglas, the senator that Lincoln debated in the Lincoln-Douglas
debate.
Not
to be confused.
Exactly. Really not good views on slavery. Mm-hmm. And Frederick Douglass, who escaped from slavery and became a writer and orator and had an extra S on his name, and was just an amazing figure because he was working both the inside and the outside. On the outside, he was very critical of Lincoln for the reasons we just said. Why are you so slow to abolish slavery? Why are you not doing more? Why do you not understand what obviously is necessary as the South goes to war? But on the inside, he supported Lincoln's Republican Party, which he knew was anti-slavery, not as radical as he wanted it to be, but he was pragmatic too, and said this party has a chance to win, which they did win. And this party is in power, and so they can do things, and I support them. And when Lincoln did finally issue the Emancipation Proclamation, Douglas took part in helping to recruit black men for the United States Army. Right. He then felt that Lincoln's administration was failing to provide equal treatment, equal pay, and other things to those black men.
So the black soldiers were not being paid the same as the white soldiers.
It was barely more than half.
Yeah.
And they couldn't be promoted as officers the way that white men could, and they had other disadvantages. And Douglas went to Lincoln at the White House to protest, to tell Lincoln off. And they ended up having a really remarkable discussion that Lincoln handled in a very effective way.
Okay, so he basically explained the politics. He said he would fix it, which he eventually did. So just how do we know about that conversation? It's a private conversation. So how do we know?
It's a private conversation. Yeah. This is true with all of these. And in fact, I might have chosen other meetings had there been better records of just what was said. In this case, there's a documentary record that includes several accounts by Frederick Douglass himself. He wrote a contemporaneous letter like a day or two afterward to the head of military recruiting, the guy who was basically his boss as a recruiter. And so that seems like a fairly reliable source that has a lot of really fascinating detail. And then he spoke about it other times. He talked about it in speeches a few months later. He wrote an article about this decades later in the 1880s, I believe. So there are differing accounts that give different details, and you have to sift it a little bit. And you have to be a little bit careful. There are other things as well, documents that came out of that meeting that can be used to produce the context. But that was a challenge with all of these 16 meetings. How much do I believe? How long after the meeting did somebody write down an account of it? Yeah. How do I reconstruct Lincoln's view of it? Sometimes Lincoln left an account of it. But of course, Lincoln did not live to write a memoir. So some of these meetings, we don't have Lincoln's side at all. And I had to choose. I try to do this with all my history. I try to choose occasions where I can document things that happened reasonably well so that we can have a fact-based discussion rather than speculating.
So speaking of speculation, and this, of course, is a hypothetical that we wondered about for a very, very long time. If Lincoln had lived, would Reconstruction have played out differently, and how would it? Because that was such a disaster. The country was one of the ugliest periods in American history. I know we try to gloss over it. There's a big debate about how we teach it in schools, but the degree of political violence, the backsliding on racial equality, it was horrific. Just give me your thoughts about if Lincoln had lived, which of course we don't know the answer definitively.
Yeah, I guess I should spend just a few seconds explaining the thing that was wrong with Lincoln being killed, aside from him being killed. He was replaced by a vice president who turned out to be politically very different than him. Andrew Johnson of Tennessee. W.E.B. Du Bois has this great history of what he calls Black Reconstruction that has a very long and sympathetic chapter about Andrew Johnson that ultimately scourges him because he deserved it. But Johnson was an interesting guy. He was a poor white man. He was in favor of the poor. He had a very populist mindset and was pro-union at a time when it was very hard and the state tried to leave the Union. But at the end of the Civil War, when he became president, he was turned away from all of that and was played upon by Southern sympathizers essentially to put his prejudice first.
Right.
His prejudice against black people.
Racist figure, right? I mean,
deeply,
he was viciously
fantastically racist. And,
fantastically.
Honestly, a lot of people, even the so-called good people in this era, are often racist by our standards. But he was a particularly bad one. And he wanted the South to remain as close to the past as it had been without technically slavery. But he was not willing, for example, to allow black men the vote. It seems clear to me that Lincoln, as a president, would have approached things differently. He also, as we noted, said things that just by definition are racist to us, but was in favor of equality, was in favor of all the equality that you could get away with politically at any given time, was talking about getting black men the vote in the very last speech of his life, and had committed to people like Frederick Douglass that having staked out a position he was not going to back up. It might still have been a disappointing and violent period that might have turned out about as it did, because Lincoln would not have been president forever. But he definitely would have taken a different approach and a more supportive approach to equality in those almost 4 years that he should have had left as president.
Well, and circling back to the fact that he was a very, very skilled politician, and I know you gave an interview to Boston NPR affiliate and talked about the one of the central understandings that Lincoln had about politics was that you needed a majority, you needed to actually win elections. And you brought this around with the interviewer to talk about what's happening with the House of Representatives. That House Republicans seem to have lost the narrative, right? That they don't seem to understand that you need a majority to get anything done, and that means you need to make some compromises you might not like.
Yeah, I feel that they blew it 3 times here, really, Charlie. And the first is the way they ran in 2022. They expected a much bigger majority, but didn't run the right kind of candidates and the right kind of campaign to get that. So they had a very small and vulnerable majority. McCarthy ended up getting a majority for the speakership, but not, it turns out, in a stable or lasting way. And then so that's 2. And then the third is Matt Gaetz. I mean, congratulations to him. He achieved his objective, but he doesn't have a majority either, which is why nobody knows what's going to happen here.
Yeah. Matt Gaetz may not care about having a majority. So, as in the same interview and I was very interested in your comments, one of the dilemmas these days covering American politics is how, and I'm ask you as a prominent member of the media, how do we cover Donald Trump? I mean, it is a unique problem. I mean, you said you're happy to say the former president is alleged to have committed a crime, but I'm not going to try to pretend that I don't already know that he tried to overturn the election that he lost. I know how difficult it is to deal with someone who lies as aggressively and consistently as Donald Trump does. But do you think, and I'm asking you to put your media critic hat on now, has the media figured out how to cover Donald Trump? Have they learned anything from 2016? Because I'm not convinced they have.
Well, I mean, you may be right about that. I mean, Trump drives a lot of clicks and a lot of attention, and it's very tempting to go into that. I think that first you need to cover Trump. And there are some people who will say, don't cover him, don't pay attention to him. We got some criticism when I interviewed Donald Trump in 2022, and I asked him some hard questions and he hung up on me. But I think it was right to cover Trump. I think it was right to talk to Trump because, I mean, think about this for a minute. Like we were just talking about Israel and Hamas. I'm going to cover Hamas. I've been to Gaza. I've talked to Hamas guys. Why would I not talk to them? They are doing things that we need to pay attention to with lives at stake. That doesn't mean I'm carrying their propaganda, but I want to understand what's going on over there in every way that I possibly can. And in the same way, of course, I'm also going to talk to an American political figure, even if he attempted to overturn his 2020 defeat, which he obviously did. And I'm going to cover him, but I want to cover him and anybody. This goes for Joe Biden. It goes for anybody. I want to cover them in context. I want to pay attention to what they're saying and failing to say. I want to pay attention to what's true and false. And when I present all of that on the air, I want to make sure that it comes with enough information and enough context that anybody listening can understand who's lying and who's telling the truth, and they can make their own judgment about who makes sense.
Okay, so I should remember this, but what did you say to him that made him hang up on you?
It was a series of questions having to do with the 2020 election.
Yeah.
I don't know that it was any one question particularly, but he made a number of false statements, and I kept correcting him and then asking further questions. And he didn't like that. And we were scheduled for 15 minutes and he hung up after a little less than 10.
Okay, I just wanted to play a little bit of that so we kind of, a reminder.
You have to solve the problem of the presidential rigged election of 2020.
Mr. President,
if I'm...
Wait, one more question. I want to ask about a court hearing yesterday on January 6th. Judge Amit Mehta, he's gone. Okay.
So interestingly, Steve, my one and only time that I interviewed Donald Trump, he didn't hang up on me, weirdly enough, back in 2016. But one of the points that I tried to make with him, and I was trying to get my head around, this was when he was making fun of Ted Cruz's wife and how she was ugly, and the thought that came to my mind was that, and I asked him about this, I said, you're running for the office that Abraham Lincoln once held, because in that moment, I had the contrast, and this is how that exchange went.
I expect that from a 12-year-old bully on the playground, not somebody who wants the office held by Abraham Lincoln.
I did a retweet, and it was a retweet by somebody else because I have a lot of support, a tremendous amount of very fervent supporters, and they were angry about what they did. It was a cover of GQ, which is not a big deal.
So we both had our Trump encounters, our Trump-Lincoln encounters here. So, Steve, having studied all of this and immersed yourself so deeply in the 19th century American history, as while you're covering what we're going through right now, how optimistic / hopeful are you? What will it take to get out of this moment? For Abraham Lincoln, it took a horrific civil war. What's it going to take for us? What do you think?
I think that it requires persistent application of the principles of democracy. Lots of people walk around saying they're worried about democracy. We don't need everybody to be an ally in that cause. We do need a majority to be an ally in that cause. And that may call for difficult compromises or reaching across to make allies. I mean, I think about someone like Liz Cheney, who ultimately lost her job over this, but worked with the committee that was investigating January 6th and produced a voluminous public record of it on a bipartisan basis, even though she was dealing with people who, if the issue were different, they'd be profoundly on different pages. And I think there were even people who kind of despised Cheney for things that she had said on various issues over the years. You need to build a majority. That means reaching out to lots of different kinds of people. If you think about this from a Democratic perspective, in 2024, Democrats are going to lose the Senate unless they do reasonably well in a number of states that are more conservative and even support senators who progressives can't stand. And if you think about it from a Republican perspective, Republicans are likely to lose the presidential election unless they can persuade suburban voters who used to be Republicans that they're not way too extreme. And so each party really has a coalition building problem, and whoever's the better coalition builder is likely to win.
But when we talk about democracy, we're not just talking about majorities, are we? We're also talking about the rule of law. We are a liberal constitutional democracy. And one of the key things that I took from your book about Abraham Lincoln was he was a very good politician, understood the need for majorities, but he was also, as you point out, a constitutionalist. And we're going to be stress testing the rule of law and whether or not the Constitution is, in fact, does have the guardrails that the founders thought they were putting in place to deal with someone like a Donald Trump.
Yeah, and honestly, I mean, ultimately, Charlie, I think you know this really well. The guardrails are great. We have lots of them, but ultimately the guardrails are people. We need people in institutions to support the institutions. We need a public that broadly understands that we have constitutional institutions. We may have to swallow things that we hate. I mean, Lincoln even said the Fugitive Slave Act of 1850, a horrible law. He said, okay, I hate it, but it's the law. It's constitutional. I'm not going to argue about it. It is the law. Lincoln said another thing, though, that I think is kind of inspirational when he was elected and before he was inaugurated, and Southern states were beginning to claim that they had left the Union. He said, there's no way that I can accept this because my job, my constitutional responsibility is to, quote, run the machine as it is. That is our first obligation as citizens. We have inherited this machine. It's worked up to now, and our first job is to run that machine as it is.
The book is Differ We Must, How Lincoln Succeeded in a Divided America. Steve Inskeep, of course, is co-host of NPR's Morning Edition and its Upfront podcast. Thank you so much for joining us on the Bulwark Podcast today, Steve.
It's an honor, Charlie. Thank you so much.
And thank you all for listening to today's Bulwark Podcast. I'm Charlie Sykes. We'll be back tomorrow, and we'll do this all over again.